I can't hear anything.
Can you hear anything, Jordan?
Okay, now I can.
Now we can.
Hey, everybody.
Hi. Welcome, Adrian. How are you tonight?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I have no idea what you just said because I had no audio, but I appreciate you having me here.
Yeah, I said the book was good. I said who we are.
Thank you.
Yeah. For viewer note for people at home, some of you may know I just had a heart attack like 3 weeks ago. So
is that true?
Yeah, it is true.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. Well, don't laugh at me. Everybody's laughing at me. So I'm not going to hold the book up the whole time like I normally do because it tires me. So I'm going to put that down now. My first question is, and it always is, and I love this question. You clearly have a lot of craft. You have a lot of talent. Why comics of all things that you could be doing?
Because I'm not sure I have a lot of craft and a lot of talent for anything else. It's I started working on comics before I could actually read or write. I think I was trying to do some version of comics when I was about 2 years old, and it's kind of something that I talk about a lot in the book. It's just like it was like this single-minded pursuit for me since I was a baby, basically. And at this point, I feel it's almost like I'm sort of stuck with it because I haven't ever put any time into really learning how to do anything else.
Well, that's all right though, because you're really good at it. 2 years old. What kind of comics were you doing at 2?
To be honest, I think the early ones were pretty incomprehensible. I've seen some of these things that have survived all the various moves that I've gone through, but you can see that I was definitely attempting to make something like comics. I was trying to draw panels and I was trying to draw dialogue balloons, and I can't make heads or tail of what I was trying to what story I was trying to tell or whatever, but I was already picking up on the kind of trappings of the medium, and somehow it appealed to me, and I was trying to emulate it. It's the earliest version of how I learned how to do everything, which is just looking at work that I enjoyed and trying to imitate it and trying to figure out how in the world these people created these things.
Were you exposed to strips early on, comic books? How did they come into the house?
A little bit of both. I've got an older brother he's 8 years older than me, so he was really responsible for bringing it into the house. And as far as strips go, we had a huge collection of Peanuts paperbacks that really was probably my first exposure to cartooning. But we also just had a routine of walking or riding bikes to the local, it was like a 7-Eleven kind of place, and just buying comics off the spinner rack, which in Corvallis, Oregon, was very limited to mostly Marvel and DC stuff. And so, for whatever reason, we gravitated towards Marvel, and I just bought anything new, whether it even really appealed to me. I just love comics so much that even if it was like a character that I didn't like that much, like Conan or something like that, I would still buy it.
Yeah. What's the first comic you can remember buying?
John Romita Spider-Man, for sure. I'm sure it wasn't the first comic that I was exposed to or the first one that I bought, but it was the first time that I put a name to an art style and got excited about that. And and I was even able to look at, I had all kinds of like Spider-Man merchandise, like posters and the vinyl album. And I could tell which of those things John Romita had drawn. So I was already kind of like picking out favorite artists at a pretty early age, but it was definitely Spider-Man. And also the, what'd they call it? I think it might've been called Marvel Tales or something, but they started reprinting the really early like Ditko Spider-Mans, which, as a John Romita fan, they looked like from a different world. But I love those. I feel like in terms of actual content, like the actual storylines and the characters and everything, I think those really early Ditko issues left a stronger impression on me. But the slickness and the prettiness of Romita's art really grabbed me when I was a kid.
Yeah. Did you try imitating that stuff?
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I think John Romita was the first artist first of many that I literally tried to imitate. Like I'd open up the comic on the table next to me and I would attempt to draw it. But as is often the case, even now, I'm when I try and do something like that, I'm completely limited not just by my ability, but by tools and equipment. So as a kid, I didn't understand that John Romita's art was probably mostly inked with a brush, and I had no idea how to do that, and I had no access to that. So I could never quite make the lines and the hair look as beautiful as he was doing. Always drove me crazy.
Yeah. You were pretty young when you started publishing your own mini comics. 16, 17, or am I off? Yeah.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And you were selling them locally, locally here.
Yeah. Starting in Sacramento. I was living in Sacramento at the time. So it started there, and on weekend trips to the Bay Area, I'd try and take a few around. But that was the start of it for sure.
Yeah. So, and your comics were autobiographical when there really wasn't a ton of material coming out then at that time. So what's the line from being a John Romita Jr. Spider-Man fan to doing...
No, John Romita Sr.
Senior, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Let's be clear.
Yeah. But from being a John Romita fan to doing autobio.
I think when I was around 11, 12, somewhere around there, I've written about this somewhere, but I had this moment where I realized that I'd turned into a comics collector and not a comics reader anymore. And so I was on this like hamster wheel obsessive kind of cycle of every weekend going to the comic book store, and they would have the comics that I'd had them pull for me. So I didn't even really shop around. They just handed me a brown bag and I paid for it and I went home. And I got into that zone of not even really enjoying the material, not even reading it, but just sort of putting it in their plastic bags and filing it alphabetically and taking some sort of weird OCD pleasure from that. But I had, when I kind of, saw myself objectively and saw what I was doing, I thought, well, maybe I've outgrown comics. Maybe it's just like some of the other things that I'm outgrowing at that point in my life. But fortunately, I lived in a town that had comic shops that had, the little alcove in the back that had stuff that was always a little daunting, or maybe it was forbidden. But so I was able to just on my own turn that corner literally and just start picking up things at random. And that's when I discovered people like the Hernandez brothers and Raw and Weirdo and Peter Bagg and Dan Clowes. And it just a whole new world opened up to me. And I realized that I was just as much a fan. I mean, it probably made me even more excited about cartooning than I'd been in a long time. And it really, I feel like all the stuff that I liked as a kid was necessary to get me to that point. And then when I got to that point, that's when I found the kind of work that I wanted to do that really clicked for me.
Yeah. What store was it? Do you remember?
Yeah, let's see. I went to a few, and some went out of business. There was World's Best Comics, God, I feel terrible that I'm blanking on some of the names now. Comics and Comics for sure. I started out going to those, and there must have been a couple others. I kind of just some sort of combination of all of those. It was, I think it even went back even a little earlier than Sacramento. I think maybe the real turning point was prior to Sacramento. I lived for a few years in Fresno, and there was a comic shop there. And I think that might've been where I bought the first issue of, remember when they repackaged Jaime Hernandez's stuff as Mechanics? It was like a comic book.
The three issue miniseries. Yeah.
Yeah. To try and make it a little more accessible to, I mean, people like me, maybe I was like the perfect audience.
It was in color too, wasn't it?
It was colored. Yeah. And it was, and they shrunk it down to fit regular comic book dimensions. So that might've been it. It might've been Sierra Comics and Books in Fresno, California.
Okay. All right. We always got to shout out to the stores who brought us here.
Of course. Yeah.
That's interesting. So you said that you mostly made the jump yourself. From the mainstream to the alt. I find that fascinating because usually people don't make that jump.
I know.
So usually what happens is people do the thing that you said, which is you realize, wait a minute, maybe this isn't for me anymore.
Yeah.
And then they walk away, and then years later they come back going, oh my God, look at all the stuff that I missed.
Right. Right. No, that's how you know that I'm like a total, lifelong comics fan, that I never had that walking away. It was just like maybe a slight pivot or something like that. But there's never been a period in my life where I wasn't buying or reading or thinking or making comics in some degree.
Yeah. Did you go to school for art at all?
No. I went to Berkeley. I went to Berkeley as an undergrad, and I started out ostensibly as an art major. And I don't know what it's like now, but it really feels like when I was in college, it was a totally different world than what we're in now. And it's possible that I might have been more encouraged and more accepted in terms of what my interests were. But at the time, it was very, very fine art, very conceptual, and it didn't feel like a place that was going to foster my interests. So I switched over to becoming an English major very, very soon after arriving at Berkeley. And so I graduated with a degree in English, and all the comic stuff was happening simultaneously. I started working for Drone Quarterly while I was in college, but it was all just done in the evening. Like I'd go to class and then I'd come home and work on my comics.
Yeah. Did you ever at any point consider, I don't know, the Kubert School or something like that?
Oh, I had such fantasies of that, because remember in the comics you'd see those ads for it, and exactly. I couldn't believe that it was a real thing. But my parents they're both Berkeley grads themselves, and I sort of applied to Berkeley on a lark, mainly just because I wanted to live in the Bay Area. Yeah. And so for whatever reason, when I got accepted, it was just sort of a foregone conclusion. Like, you got in, you better go, Although probably in my heart, I would have been happy to go to, any art school in New York City or something like that. But
so you started doing the mini comics, and you're a kid. I mean, I wonder what that was like for you, both from the, I don't know, the sort of the hubris of publishing your own thing, right?
Totally.
And then taking it around to stores and that part of it, like having to sell yourself at such a young age.
Yeah, no, it's very arrogant. It's very, very contrary to what my outward personality was. I was very ambitious and very driven, and obviously, I mean, it didn't feel like it at the time, but in hindsight, I must have had some belief in myself and my work to put it out there in the way that I did. Because as a person, I was very, very shy and very self-doubting, and so it's definitely some sort of two parts of my brain, two parts of my personality that were at war with each other then. I really think maybe I just funneled all my self-confidence and ambition into the comic stuff, and there was none left in terms of socializing in high school or anything like that. It was all spent on the comic stuff.
Yeah. Were they, I mean, obviously you did what, 7, 9 of them? I can't quite.
Yeah, 7 mini comics. Yeah.
So, and that implies that they were successful enough that you could see that there was a path there. Yeah.
It was, it was the perfect encouragement for me, which is that each one seemed to get a little bit more response and would sell a little better. So like the first mini comic, I printed up 25 copies, and I was thrilled when eventually all those copies had sold on consignment, at the local comic shops. And it sort of just increased a little bit with each issue. And especially towards the end, between like issues 5, 6, and 7, it felt like these big leaps in terms of the response I was getting and the number of copies that stores in different parts of the country wanted me to send them. And just, I mean, I think the biggest thing was mail. I had a PO box, and just when I started getting letters from cartoonists who were like heroes to me, I think that was like the biggest breakthrough and the biggest encouragement, really.
Yeah, like unsolicited letters. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, really, really amazing, and it really is something that I try to keep in mind, because sometimes I'll get into a zone now where I think like, I enjoyed that comic, but why bother telling the artist? Because like, who cares? They get so much praise, and they're doing fine or whatever. But it really, So I don't know if it's true for everyone else, but for me, hearing from published cartoonists, people who I respected, even if it was criticism, but the fact that they knew who I was and that they wanted to reach out to me in some way, I think it really is a big part of why I am where I am right now.
Yeah. Yeah. As I recall, I was working at Best of Two Worlds at the time that especially those last 3 issues came out. And I remember we were getting like 50 copies at a time, I mean, which was phenomenal for something like that, and people were really excited.
Wait, was Best of Two Worlds in Berkeley or in San Francisco? Or
it was in both. They also had a store in Santa Rosa, I want to say. It was a 3-store chain. The guy who founded it was one of the original founders of Comix and Comics, and then he split and started doing his own stores. Yeah.
Right. So
both I and Rory Root worked there. And then within a year, both Rory and I started our own stores. So,
What year was that?
I opened in '89. So Rory opened in '88, I want to say. Might have been '87.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. But back in the old days, makes me feel old when I think about it sometimes.
Yeah.
But I can't think really of any other mini that was coming out at the time that had that level of success, and it was very exciting. I mean, especially because you were a Bay Area kid, and you were so young, and you had so much craft even then, Obviously, I'm sure you look at your old work and wince at it a little bit.
For sure. But I've begged Ron and Quarterly to put that out of circulation, the old mini comic stuff. But I think what you're describing was one of the main reasons why I wanted to stop self-publishing, because I found myself spending way more time than I wanted on packing up boxes and chasing after checks and all that stuff that was antithetical, or at least was getting in the way of actually producing the work. So I think it's like every self-publisher's, it's the most high-class problem to have. But it was, and also I was in college at the time, so I was living in a house with a bunch of roommates and storing boxes of books all around the house, and trying to at least pass my classes, and then trying to ship off orders to all kinds of places and everything. And it turned into like a real strange, kind of a job almost,
Well, yeah, of course it's a job. It's business, right? I mean,
I guess.
business comics,
Yeah, but like everything else related to my career, it just felt like this weird natural outgrowth of the hobby of being a comics fan. It didn't feel like I ever said like, now I'm going to be a publisher or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I just kept surprising myself. I'd sort of look around and be like, how did I get here?
Yeah. How did you get on the radar of D&Q? Did you submit? Did they come to you?
No. That's the thing, is I meet a lot of young artists, and I think when they're talking about trying to get published, they're under the misapprehension that like I was scouted, that Drawn and Quarterly came and knocked on my door and said, we want to publish you or something like that. But it's very much the opposite, that I was an obsessive Drawn and Quarterly fan. I had fantasies of being part of that company, of working there. When they first started publishing comics, like their core group, I was just the biggest fan of all of those artists, and I just had such dreams of being, on that team. And so I was sending issues of my mini comic to Chris Oliveros, who was the publisher at the time. Every time I had a new issue, he was the first person I'd send a copy to, and I kind of wore him down. I didn't hear from him for a long time, and then I think around the time of my 6th mini comic, I got a quick note from him that was more of a critique than anything else, but it was an acknowledgement of all the things I had been sending him, and that started our relationship, and that eventually led to him offering to take over the publication duties.
Yeah. Were you also sending to Fana?
Yeah.
Eclipse and places like that as well?
Not Eclipse. I think somehow I definitely bought a lot of Eclipse comics in my time, but I think by that point, the point that we're describing, where I was trying to, turn this optic nerve mini comic into a professional thing. I'm not even sure, was Eclipse even around still, or maybe I just in my mind thought of it as more of a genre. Yeah, I mean, I think I was just thinking of it like they publish, Airboy or something like that. And I was really a big Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly fan by that point.
Yeah. It seems like there must have been at least, Kitchen was still around then.
Kitchen was around, and let's see, Slave Labor, and
Slave, absolutely. Well, and Slave was a Bay Area.
Yeah, and I was in contact with a Canadian company. I think first they were called Black Eye Press or Tragedy Strikes Press or something like that, and then turned into Black Eye Press. Yeah, there were a bunch that I was in touch with for sure, but for whatever reason, I think the fact that Drawn and Quarterly had such a small roster, like of course Fantagraphics published some of my favorite artists of all time and the biggest influences on me, but they also had so much, and it just seemed like, oh my God, they're the place that publishes Prince Valiant, like, whereas I looked at Drawn and Quarterly and I just thought like, well, they've got Julie Doucet, Seth, Chester Brown, and Joe Matt, and that's it.
Yeah.
And it just, I don't know, somehow it just, it seemed a little more perfect to me and more accessible.
Yeah. Interesting. Jordan tells me we've got our first question, so we're going to put it up on the screen.
Oh, okay.
In terms of craft, what helped you define your style in the early days?
Good question. Thanks for sending that in. What defined my style? Like I said, my whole career, I feel like, has been kind of a quest to discover what really is my own style, because the only kind of training I had, the only instruction I had, was looking at other comics that I liked and trying to copy them. And even in my published work, you can see phases of huge influences by other artists. And so, my style was completely defined by the influence of other cartoonists. And I guess in the last 10, 15 years, I feel like my challenge has been to try and somehow figure out what actually is my own, and what was taken from someone else, and how to incorporate that more. So yeah, it was completely formed by that, by the work of other artists. And if anyone wants specifics, I mean, like I said, in the early days, it was John Romita, Charles Schultz, Steve Ditko, and then the kind of like nuclear bombs that went off for me and really, really turned my head around. It was Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez, Daniel Klaus, everything in Weirdo and Raw. I think American Splendor probably had a big impact on me when I first saw it. Maybe not in terms of my art style, but in terms of content. And so that's really what it was. It was the comics of the time that completely shaped me.
Mm-hmm. Did you at any point think that it would be harder or more difficult being an Asian American?
No, and I would say that's kind of a great example of blissful ignorance, just kind of working to your advantage. That it didn't occur to me at all, and I guess I'm embarrassed to say, to a degree, that I didn't even think of myself as an Asian American artist. Contrary to what some people have been writing about the new book, my experience with so-called racism or discrimination or anything was completely minimal, and much less of that occurred within the comics industry than what actually occurred in normal life. So I feel sort of bad that those little anecdotes have been really seized upon in a lot of the press, as if like I had to survive this horribly racist industry or something like that, because that was not my experience. And in fact, the thing that kind of opened my eyes more and sort of made me realize or change my perception about some of that stuff actually came more from the Asian American community or Asian American journalists that I would do interviews with. And they had a lot of questions about the types of characters that I was depicting and the types of stories that I was writing. And I think it was really that experience that made me think like, oh, okay, I forgot that there are these other factors involved aside from just learning the right inking technique and what kind of Bristol board to use and all these things that I was so focused on. So no, it wasn't on my mind at all when I entered into the business. And to be honest, I didn't have a lot of experiences, especially early on, that made me suddenly aware of that either.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's my impression that the early days of the comics industry, while certainly there's an awful lot of white people, we talk about people like, like the Hernandez brothers. I mean, I don't think anybody was like, oh, they're Latino. I never heard that from anybody. Or all the Filipino artists in the 70s.
Of course, yeah. No, I
amazing,
really felt
towering talents, and I always feel like comics, it was the work that mattered more than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely felt that. Like I didn't feel that anyone was giving me any kind of breaks because I was Asian, but I also didn't feel like anyone was holding it against me. Like I said, I think the earliest instances of articles or reviews that refer to my background came from more like Asian American publications rather than a comics industry publication.
Yeah. And is that relatively recent as well then? Yeah. Or not?
No, that started happening in the early days,
Okay.
as soon as I was getting published. Yeah, I can think of cases of that back in the 90s.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. You continued doing Optic Nerve at D&Q for another 10 issues or so, roughly. It was 7 issues?
No. I think there's 14. There might be 13 or 14.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
What attracted you to the serialization?
Complete adherence to tradition and not thinking beyond that at all. I mean, to me, that was just what making comics was. It was putting out a comic that had those dimensions and had the same title and came out as regularly as possible. That I had no thought of any other way of doing it. It wasn't a choice. It was just like, that's how comics are made, at least when I was starting out.
Sure. Oh, I mean, I think it helped build your brand, as it were, as well. I mean, again, having the consistent name throughout regular production. Sometimes I see all of the young students that are graduating every year, and they're all putting out graphic novels, and I think,
yeah,
wow, you're going to be off the market for 2 years in between projects. Like, how are you going to build your audience at that point?
Mm-hmm.
I
don't. It's interesting. It's now everything's changed, right? I think it's more common that a young cartoonist will start out just making a graphic novel, and you don't see as much of the serialized, like, ongoing comics as much anymore.
Do you think that the limitations of the package, in other words, that you only have 20 to 28 pages to tell your story, do you think that made you a stronger cartoonist?
I think so. I think yeah, I think so. I think it was definitely a good learning process. I mean, like, now I love the experience of being able to just make a book and have it be as long as it needs to be. But I am very nostalgic for that whole experience, like, of putting together a comic book. I never had like an art director or a designer or anything like that. I just every issue of Optic Nerve, whether it was a mini comic or a drawn quarterly book, was completely done by hand or whatever, on a computer by me. And so that used to be like a once or twice a year kind of cycle that I was in. Like, I would finish the interior pages, and then I'd start to design the cover, and I'd typeset like a letters page, and even just like figuring out how to fit the indicia in the amount of space that I had, and designing like kind of fake ads for some of the other merchandise in the back. And all that, to me, felt like just as much of an important part of the process of making a comic as actually drawing the things on the inside pages. And so I definitely miss that as an artist and a reader. Like, I mean, how cool would it be if every year there was like a new issue of 8 Ball with like a letters page and ads and all that stuff. I mean,
I miss letters pages, and I miss that dialogue, particularly that it showed you, well, this was before the internet, obviously, but it showed you that there were other people like you out there that thought the same way that you did, And
there's such great time capsules too. Like, if I go back and look through issues of Optic Nerve, and I'd say at least half the people who sent in letters have gone on to be known for something much more important, as artists themselves or as critics or something else. And that's true of a lot of those alternative comics from that era. If you look at the letters column from Hate or from 8 Ball, it's kind of mind-blowing to see who some of those names were.
Yeah. Now, you said you were doing it yourself. Did Chris have any editorial input? Did he?
No. His famous line to me was always, "I look forward to reading it when it comes back from the printer."
Nice.
He liked to see the finished product.
That's an amazing amount of freedom to have. When somebody else is paying the bill.
He destroyed me for life in terms of working with art directors, with other editors. Anything I do is going to involve a higher degree of input and collaboration and oversight than what I had from Drawn and Quarterly. And he was always, and this is true today with Drawn and Quarterly, that they are as helpful as I need them to be, and they come through beautifully and pull off things that I wouldn't be able to do in a million years. But it's all contingent upon me asking for it. And other than that, the assumption is that I'm okay on my own.
Yeah. That's great. That's great to hear. Jordan says there's another question for us. Let's put it up. Jesse Rimler says, often cartoonists are drawn to the form for the artwork, and the storytelling craft comes later, if at all. Did you spend a lot of time studying storytelling itself outside of the medium?
Oh, outside of the medium? Yes, but yeah. So two parts to the answer is that one, a lot of it was done within the medium. Like I was and still am an obsessive comics reader when there's something that I like, and I guess this is true outside the medium as well. If there's a movie I like, if there's a comic I like, a novel, I often reread it a lot. I take it apart. I try and figure out how it was done. I love to like read interviews with the artist or the author or whatever to find out about the process. So yeah, definitely. Also, it's hard to quantify exactly how much this impacted what I do now, but I was, like I said, an English major at Berkeley, which is not, it was not a creative writing program, but it was a reading and criticism kind of program. So I was exposed to a ton of literature that I would have been too timid to tackle on my own, and was forced to really engage with it in a way that especially at that age of my life, I probably would not have otherwise. And I think, like I said, just movies especially have always been a kind of a parallel passion of mine with comics, and like I said, anything that I enjoy, I enjoy it once as just a passive viewer, and I let it wash over me, and then I start to really take it apart and really try and figure out how it was all done. And that's always just been an interest of mine.
Yeah, comics are very different than film or prose, obviously, but particularly in that the audience is much more in control, right? In terms of how fast you read, what the page turns are. Going back, I mean, I certainly when I read a comic many times, I'll flip back 5 pages and reread a sequence right then. Not a thing that one does when one watches a movie, right?
No, it's one of our, the frustrations and one of the blessings, but it's sort of like, we have to, as the creators, accept that it's a bit of a collaboration with the reader, that we're not controlling time. We're not dictating how long they're going to look at each page or panel, when they're going to take a break or anything like that. We have far less control, especially compared to filmmakers. But I think that's, in a way, at least for me, that's what's really engendered the strong level of fandom and the connection, the deep personal connection to work, because of that collaborative nature and that feeling that, like, I guess especially when I was a kid, when there wasn't the home video experience, when there wasn't streaming, I sometimes had trouble enjoying, like, if I got to go see The Empire Strikes Back or something like that, I had almost a hard time enjoying it because I knew that with each minute it was leaving my life. Like I was not going to have it anymore. And that was terrifying and troubling to me as a fan. And so it was really comforting and just very engaging for me to be able to, like, open up a comic book, like a Spider-Man comic, and put on my bed and just study it at my own pace and put it away and know that in the morning I could get it again and repeat that experience.
Yeah, no, kids today don't really grasp it. My son's 16, and I I tried to explain to him how television used to work, how you got one shot. That was it. You got one shot at watching a show. And if you didn't watch it right then at the time it was broadcast, you'd never, ever see it again.
Oh, yeah.
And you had
and
to
I was
schedule your life around it, you know?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I would, every Sunday, I would get the TV section out of the newspaper and I would like make my schedule for the week of things that I couldn't miss. And, you know, that was especially because I was young and I was living in small towns. That was also my only chance to see a lot of movies. Like I was not going to go see old movies in a theater somewhere. And there was no way to access it other than when they were going to be rerun on like a Sunday afternoon on a TV channel or something. So I would totally, schedule my life around some of these things. And I would actually, in the pre-VCR era, I would make tape recordings of movies and TV shows, like just audio recordings.
Yep.
Did you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I love, especially things like Monty Python. You know, because it went by so fast, I couldn't really understand it as I was watching it. You know.
Oh yeah.
The jokes were so thick. You know, you gotta learn that stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that Ramita was sort of the first thing that light bulbed you on a creator and craft.
Yeah.
Can you point to, is it the same or something different that light bulbed you about how time and space work in comics? Right? Because I always say the comics are not the individual drawings. Comics are the gutters.
Yeah.
That's actually where comics happen, is that leap that you make in the gutter.
Yeah. That's definitely true. And that was something that was both intuitive and something that I studied deeply. So, when I was a kid, very young, I couldn't articulate that, and I didn't intellectually quite understand it, but I definitely knew that there was some magic happening, even, when I was reading Peanuts comic strips, feeling totally perplexed when I would see them laid out the way they originally were, because I was used to those tall, skinny paperbacks where they were sort of broken up in a more vertical format,
right.
and feeling what a difference it made to see just how the panels were arranged on a page. And so I think I think kind of what you're talking about is something that is, I would imagine, is one of the most difficult things to teach about cartooning. It's pretty easy to teach someone how to use a certain tool or something like that. But there's a certain thing, what you're talking about, like the magic that happens in the gutters, that kind of stuff, that I think you can study, you can read books about, and you can listen to a lecture on. But I think it doesn't compare to the experience of taking it in your whole life and absorbing it and trying to emulate it. And it really feels to me almost like a language, like the difference between being a native speaker of a language and taking a class as an adult and learning the basic vocabulary or something like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you 100% there. Did you have much experience to manga?
No. I am probably the last, probably anyone younger than me grew up in a world where manga was more prevalent, and more easily accessible and more just a part of the fabric of life. It was actually, for my age, it was pretty difficult to find manga, pretty difficult to find translations, and then within that, very difficult to find stuff that appealed to me. It was something that I would look at occasionally, because I would, go to a store in Japantown or something and find some paperback that I didn't know what it was, but I would look through it, or I would have a relative go on a trip to Japan and they would just randomly buy something at the airport and for me to look at. but I really did not have the experience of being able to read it like in translation at all in my life. Like I feel like that really exploded after I was already working as a cartoonist.
Yeah, because the Japanese have I mean, it's the same language. Obviously, it's the same language of comics, but they use it very, very differently. I always think of examples like in a scene like in Lone Wolf and Cub, where there's a samurai fight that's about to happen, and they'll spend 3 pages of the wind whistling through the trees and a leaf slowly falling to the ground, and it increases the tension in this really interesting way. Getting exposed to that really opened up a lot of my eyes about the power of time and space in comics.
And I think you can actually really see, you can almost kind of set your watch to the point at which manga became one of the equal parts of the American comics reading experience, because you have artists who, younger than me, who you see such an influence from manga in their work, whether it was conscious or not. But you go back just 10 years and someone doesn't have that in their work at all. And I think, unfortunately, I fall into that category where it just wasn't available to me that much when I was when I really could have been inspired by it.
Yeah. Well, it feels to me that, and correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but you're a lot more focused on craft, I suppose, than that kind of storytelling. Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, in terms of, you have a very precise line, I would say, and I don't know how to go deeper on that necessarily.
I think, I feel like it's almost like some of the stuff that I admire most about manga, like some of those things that you were describing, I get a little conflicted about, because I'm so also focused on economy and trying to work as quickly as I'm capable of, and working alone on my own without assistance or anything. And so as a reader, I see things like you're describing where I think like, that is so cool to be able to slow down the pace and focus on this leaf falling or whatever. But for me, I feel like, oh God, it takes so long for me to finish a book. Like I got to be as concise as possible too.
Yeah. How was the decision made to stop Optic Nerve as a serialized book, to then go on to doing graphic novels? I mean, obviously, you would get 3 or 4 issues and you'd put out shortcomings or whatever. But was that a decision that D&Q helped you make? Was that a decision you came to on your own, that, let's just skip that other step and just go straight for the book?
I don't know if it's a decision that's even been made. I mean, this new book is the first book that I've done that wasn't serialized. Killing and Dying actually did come out as 3 issues of Optic Nerve, the last ones to date, at least. So it's not like a firm decision was ever made. So who knows? I think for this particular book, I envisioned it from the onset as the object that it is. And if you read the book, you'll sort of see how the form of the book is intrinsically tied into the content, and it sort of, kind of folds back in on itself. And so I really wanted, for a number of reasons, for it to come out the way it did, rather than being serialized first. But that might not always be the case. I don't know.
Do you feel it's advantageous to you, or I don't know. I mean, I always wonder about this, particularly for people who have a background in serialization. Does it mean more pre-planning, or does it mean that you're drawing stuff and throwing it out, or do you see what I'm asking there?
Yeah, I loved, so I'd say the first, I don't know, the first bunch of issues of Optic Nerve were done thinking only of the comic. It was like, I'll do the next issue, and then Chris Oliveros would say, hey, you have enough pages now to turn it into a book. And we'd say, okay, let's think of a title and let's put it together. But with starting with Shortcomings, I was really thinking of eventually having a complete book. And so that held true for Shortcomings, for Killing and Dying.
Yeah.
And I totally loved and benefited from the process of serialization because it was, and especially as comic books, like the pamphlets, started to become a little less common, and I felt a little bit, those issues felt a little bit more under the radar. It felt like I was able to put out a first draft, and I was able to get feedback from the real fans, the people who were still going to comic stores and buying each issue as it came out and bothering to write me letters. And all of that was really helpful to me for when I then edited it and transformed it into what became the book. So when I put out this new book, it was the first time I had that experience of going straight into book form. And I was nervous. I felt like, oh, I didn't get that first little safety net of the Optic Nerve readers correcting me on things and pointing out mistakes and things like that.
Yeah. So that was harder then to do this, or
yeah, definitely. I putting out an issue of Optic Nerve is my comfort zone for sure. Like that's something that I've been doing since I was 15 or 16 years old in some format, and going straight into a book felt like a new challenge for me.
Yeah. What's your maybe let's talk about process a little bit.
Sure.
Do you thumbnail out the whole book? Are you doing it as you go? What's your process here?
It really varies from book to book. This book was a departure for me because it's the least amount of pre-planning that I've done for anything, at least since the mini comic days. I pretty much wrote the book in my mind, and that's why it was helpful to break it up into little anecdotes rather than one continuous narrative.
Yeah.
Because within my mind, I can write a 4-page story and I can know exactly what happens in each panel of those 4 pages. And then when it comes time to draw it, I can just execute and put it on paper. But this was definitely the first time I've worked that loosely and that directly. And Killing and Dying, the process was different from story to story, but with Shortcomings, it was a way that I haven't worked since, and I probably will never go back to, which was like really breaking my mind up into like different jobs. Like I was still thinking of, the Marvel Comics way of like a writer writes a script and then an artist turns it into the panels. And so, Shortcomings was written out, it was typed out like a script, and then broken down into thumbnails and then penciled and inked. And I don't know. I mean, I now am sort of also, regardless of whether that was a good way or not to work, I don't really have the time or the interest in working in that way anymore. And I really, with the new book, I had a new kind of an unusual experience, which is that making the pages was fun for me, and that wasn't something that I'd felt in a long time because it was such a labored and slow process. But to like a page from Shortcomings took me about a week to complete, and then there was a whole long period before that of writing. And with this new book, I was at my best. I was doing a page a day, which put me in such a good mood. At the end of the day, I was so thrilled that I'd done one page.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Are you Actually, I have to wonder, is part of that the smaller size of the format and sort of the lower amount of information per page? Yeah.
Yeah. And allowing myself to draw in my most natural mode. I was really trying to figure out what would be the comics equivalent for me of my handwriting, where you don't, when you're writing a letter to someone or whatever, you don't think about how do I form an A? What should that look like? And that's exactly the way I was working with in comics prior to that, where every little thing was like, okay, now I have to draw clouds. Okay, in the history of comics, how have clouds been drawn? All this obsessive kind of thought. And with this book, I thought, like, let me just have the idea in my mind and as quickly as possible and as clearly as possible communicate that to the reader. And that actually was a much quicker process for me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because that's sort of ties back to what I was saying before, that I always felt like you were about craft in a lot of ways, and you literally just said that you were thinking about how do I form that A,
Too much so. Yeah. I think to a fault. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, a comic strip artist can't do that, right? Like you have a daily deadline. You must produce or else.
That was 100% my inspiration on this book was going back and reading interviews with old cartoonists, especially Schultz, and trying to just almost trick myself into thinking I was a daily strip cartoonist. And it's such a different mindset to think, okay, I don't have all the time in the world, because a lot of us have been given this gift of having no deadline, and so we just can be perfectionists and run it into the ground. And so to try and think that I was on a daily deadline, and that instantly puts you into the mindset that I think a lot of strip artists are in, which is like, it doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be good enough. And I accept the fact that some days are better than others. And if one strip is not great, tomorrow's a new day. And I really tried to apply that to this book. And so for sure, there are pages that I look at, especially when I was scanning in the art, and I'd be like, this one isn't perfect. I should probably fix it. No. And then I would just talk myself out of it and say, like, okay, it's good enough. It's good enough. And just let it go, which is, I think to some people that would sound like being lazy or being careless as I get older, but it's really a much bigger challenge for me to get to that mindset than to be a meticulous perfectionist.
Well, it sounds liberating to me.
Totally.
Not lazy. To give yourself the freedom just to draw and just to create, rather than obsess. That's, I don't know. It just seems like that will ultimately yield better art.
Well, the 2 points in my career that I enjoyed making the work the most were the very beginning when I was doing the mini comics, and right now with this book. It's been the time where I would actually end the day in a good mood and feel happy about what I'd done. And a lot of the years in between, it was the opposite. It would be like just agony.
Yeah. So you said that you were sort of constructing a lot of this in your head. So when you sit down for a day, you've got a blank page in front of you. Are you just go and just start laying it out? Is that how you're working now?
I think a lot of the strips in this book, like I said, were basically written in my mind. And then just to play it safe, I might do an extremely loose, like stick figure first draft in a sketchbook or something like that. But then go right on to the art. And, in the past, I have actually folders in my closet that are like versions of Optic Nerve issues, but just slightly less polished. Like I would actually draw panels really well and then almost use that as a guide for the final art. Or I went into a phase where I was obsessed with the fact that art kind of looks distorted when you flip it in a mirror or see it reversed. And I thought I had to correct it. I thought that it needed to look perfect both ways. So I was penciling on acetate and flipping it over and making corrections and then tracing it back onto the Bristol board, and
Wow.
all these things that I don't think had any discernible improvement to the work, but slowed me down considerably.
Wow. Wow. You still work on pen and paper, I'm assuming?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, it's hard for me to imagine changing that aspect of my work, but then so many people I know have made that shift even kind of late in their career and have done it incredibly. Like, I was actually shocked when someone told me that Ben Catcher had started working digitally, because I didn't see the change,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that shows you how the tools are sometimes too. Your hand lettering as well, yeah?
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's important to me. I feel like that's one thing that I haven't seen, that I haven't been convinced of. Like, I've definitely been tricked by artwork now that's been done on a tablet or something, and I didn't even notice. But the difference between hand lettering and font lettering is still very apparent to me, and I always have a preference for hand lettering, even though I know how much more work it involves. But as a reader, like, and especially now that I'm reading stuff with my kids, so like the comics for kids, and it's everything is like a font, and it's just always disappointing to me.
Yeah. How does it, just out of curiosity, how does it work with, say, translations of your work?
It's a font most of the time. Yeah. They usually they have to like scan in my handwriting and turn it into something. Yeah, most of the time. There's a few translations of mine that are beautifully hand lettered, kind of emulating my lettering. But I understand that's generally not practical.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you I don't think we've got a specific question on deck, but do you want to put just a couple up? Let's sort of do a lightning round of questions.
Okay.
The ultraviolence, ultraviolence X. But this is a good question. Not sure if there's an elegant way to put this, but what is your work-life balance like?
That is a good question, and it's something that has been completely changed by having kids. And prior to that, the balance was extremely weighted in the direction of work, and I would often work through the night. When I lived in Berkeley, I was on this work schedule where I would actually kind of start really working at like 9 or 10 p.m. and I would work through the night and then go to bed at like 11 in the morning or something like that, which is impossible when you have kids. And now I think that balance is really important, like an actual balance between working and enjoying life and enjoying the time that my kids are living at home. And so that is a big reason for the current book and the way it looks and the subject matter and everything, was because I wanted, especially after completing Killing and Dying, which took me 7 years, I did not want to jump right into another experience like that. And I wanted to find a project that, like I described, I could feel a sense of accomplishment with each day, but also not feel like it had taken over my life, and that I was not going to be, upset if one of my kids was sick from school and it changed my work day or something like that. So that's, I think, at least for the next chunk of my life, that is going to be a big factor in how I choose projects, because I have to say, a little bit to my surprise, like I have enjoyed parenthood so much more than I expected, and already have a little bit of that feeling of the sand dropping between my fingers and wanting to enjoy the time as much as possible.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, obviously your comics are not for kids, particularly, or it's not like they would be damaged by reading this, but I can't really imagine any kid reading this and really getting a lot out of it. Have you given any thought, since you said you've been reading comics with your kids, have you been given any thought to doing something aimed at a younger audience?
I have, especially because my daughter is a big proponent of that. My oldest daughter is probably like the world's biggest Raina Telgemeier fan, and as well as all books that have followed in her example. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge for me. It's not like like doing a kid's book to me is as much of a challenge as doing a science fiction book. I feel like it is built on a history that I'm not completely familiar with. I'm getting up to speed a little bit more with the young adult comics, and it's almost like it's so I'm removed enough that it's hard for me to even know what makes a good version of it. Like if especially comics or books for really young kids. Like I'm always trying to predict what my younger daughter is going to really gravitate towards too, and I'm not a very good predictor of that.
Yeah, interesting. You got another question for me, Jordan? Aya Agawa says, could you imagine, or maybe this is in the works, any of your books to be adapted into a film?
Yes, I could imagine, and there are things that are in the works. I mean, I have a friend who told me the best time to talk about an adaptation of your work is the day that it opens in the theater, because so much can happen up until that point. But yeah, there is more than ever a bunch of stuff in the works, and the fun thing for me, and I think it'll be interesting for viewers, is that I have like very different levels of involvement in a few different projects. Like there's something that's being done completely without my involvement at all. Like I'm just learning about it through emails. And then there's something that I'm very much involved in, and I'm writing myself. And then there's stuff kind of somewhere in between too. Yeah, I think there was a long period where everything was just so nebulous and it just seemed like nothing was ever going to happen. But I am, especially just as of recently, feeling a lot more optimistic about the possibility that at least some of these things might actually come to fruition. Yeah, and it's fun for me too. I want to say that it's something that I'm really enjoying quite a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I because so much of your work is autobiographical. It's hard to picture something not being particularly involved. I mean, even to the point like if someone animated something of yours, I'd almost want yours to be the narrator voice.
No. These are all discussions that I have had with people, and I just, like I said, I hope that a number of these things come to fruition because they're all so different, and I think it'll be really interesting to see what something looks like that someone just took some of the basic material and ran and created their own thing versus something that I poured my heart into and wrote every word of. I have no idea what will lead to the better film. Just because I'm more involved doesn't necessarily mean that it'll lead to a better end product.
Sure.
And I take comfort in the fact that I still feel like no matter what, the books are my official version of the material, and any other interpretation is sort of like this alternate reality thing that I'm excited to see, but it doesn't obliterate the original one.
Yeah, no, very much so. Next question from Faith Lim. Who are the comic artists you're into right now?
Oh, wow. Okay. Right now, I don't get to go to a comic store that often. So I'd say for the last, 6 months or even more, I have not been as much in touch as I used to be.
You've certainly been in lockdown during that time too.
Yes, exactly. And I've been homeschooling my kids. So the time available to find new stuff has been cut into quite a bit. But right now, I will mention that I'm really, really a big fan of this guy named Olivier Schrauen, who is in America is mostly published by Fantagraphics, and I love the books that they've put out. I just recently got the first issue of a series that he's working on now called Sunday, and it's very limited quantity, so I haven't even been able to track down issue 2. But issue 1 I loved, and I thought was just a brilliantly like creative and original, but also masterful in terms of the command of the medium, which is a great combination to find these days, and very funny too, which is very, a nice quality to have. So that's like the most recent artist that I've gotten really excited about. But I sort of the evolution of my taste is definitely slow. Like I'm not constantly jumping onto the next big thing that I'm excited about. And so someone to me like, I still think of people like Noah Van Sciver or Lisa Hannah-Walt. I mean, I think of them as like new young cartoonists, but they've been working for quite a long time. But yeah, so those are a few that come to mind right now. Trying to think what else.
Is there anything in the kids space that you thought has been particularly interesting?
Kids space. I think that was really good. Trying to think. It was a big event in our house when Guts came out. I think that was last summer. I even went to the effort to track down an advance copy of it so that I could impress my daughter with it. And she loved it, and I did too. And I was really impressed with. I don't know if this was the case, but it felt to me that Raina had slowly established a relationship with an audience and with the world, really, that allowed her to tell that particular story. Like, it couldn't have been her first book necessarily. Absolutely. And to get to a point where you could speak to millions of kids and come out and encourage them to seek therapy if they need it, to face and talk about anxieties, to not feel alone with ailments that you find embarrassing. I thought that was really like an impressive way to use the platform that she had developed over those years.
Yeah, no, very much so. I might make 2 recommendations for you.
I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
People who have impressed me lately.
Yeah.
Mai K. Nguyen, who did Pilu of the Woods, that was published by Oni.
People of the Woods?
Pilu, Pilu. Pilu of the Woods. Mai K. Nguyen. That was one of my favorite books last year. And the other one I would say would be Brenna Thumler, who did Sheets, that came out from Lion Forge, which I guess is all now Oni. So yeah, both of those are fantastic books, and I suspect that if your daughter likes Raina, she will also like them.
Really?
And young new cartoonists coming out with really exciting work is always the thing that really thrills me, is like these new kids coming in and they do great work, and you're like, wow, because we also have a kids club that we do. So I'm reading a lot of kids literature these days. In addition to the adult stuff. So
that's great. Thank you.
That's my little bit for you.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah. You got another one for me? Okay. Podrigo again, who asked really good questions. Do you have any favorite anecdote from the book in terms of how the finished product turned out?
That's a good question. Let me think. Yeah, I can think of a couple. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about work, and I'm so self-critical in some ways that it's hard for me to talk about something that's a favorite or something that I feel was successful. But to me, one way I gauge it is that a lot of those anecdotes in the early part of the book are stories, as you can imagine, that I've told a million times, like in a social situation or something like that. And sometimes the challenge was for me to figure out a way to tell that same story, but in the very limited constraints that I placed on myself for the storytelling. Because when I'm telling the story in person, I can stop the narrative and give a little background detail or give a little aside or backtrack or whatever. And to do it in this comics format where there wasn't any narration and there isn't like the modern day version of me butting in to comment on the work or anything like that was a challenge sometimes. And so a good example of that is I forget the actual title of it, but it's the one when we're in Penn Station and my daughter has a tantrum and various people come up and one person recognizes me and wants to talk about the Wilson movie, and then we get some unsolicited parenting advice from from an older woman in the train station. So that's a story that I've told in person many times, and it's usually gets a big laugh. But it was really hard for me to figure out how to tell that in comics form and to have the same effect. And so I did work pretty hard on it. And the fact that people have told me that the thing that I shout out has now become sort of a catchphrase in their house or something like that feels like a great accomplishment to me. And the last story in the book, the long one, was probably one of the most challenging stories I've had to do in terms of opening myself up and being that earnest, and to not, couch it in terms of a cheap laugh or the humor that most of the previous parts of the book was based on, and to have to really be like, okay, this is autobiography. It's not a fictional character. I'm not making a joke out of it. This is dead serious, and it's about stuff that's pretty sentimental. It's about, talking to your kids when you think you're dying or something like that. Talking to your wife when you feel like you're reevaluating your life a little bit. And that was really hard for me, especially because I feel like I come from a generation of smartasses, like the cartoonists that I've built, that I've emulated, have all been very ironic, sarcastic, dark, irreverent. And so to kind of try and for a little bit do the opposite of that was really daunting for me, and I felt really exposed in a way that was uncomfortable for me putting it together.
Yeah. Did you, out of curiosity, did you write and draw the stories in the order they're presented, or did you? Yeah, so you did. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty much first page to last page just went in order.
Interesting. Okay. So really kind of not an editing process on this book.
There was a lot of cutting out. So when I was kind of planning it out and doing kind of like little stick figure versions of some of these anecdotes, this was the first book where I felt like I had too much material. Like in the past, I will admit that I've tried to sort of pad out my books, and I have these conversations with my friend Tracy Huron at Drawn and Quarterly, where we're talking about, like, can I get away with doing a second title page, and can we get thicker paper stock so that the spine is actually bigger? And with this one, I just felt like it so easily could have been twice as long. I had that many ideas and anecdotes. So the editing really was just in terms of chopping out stuff and deciding what really was going to be the best stuff, what would really make the cut.
Oh, nice. You got another question for me? Hey, it's Seth Rosenblatt. Loneliness was much lighter in tone than a lot of your books that I read in the 90s. Can you talk about how your style has grown over the years and what you feel was intentional and what less so?
Yeah, I think he's right. I have to give a lot of credit in terms of that evolution to my wife. I think I've said this before in another interview, so sorry if it's a repetition. But when I met my wife, she did not know anything about comics, had not read any of my work. And so she got to just know me before she read anything I did. And eventually when she sat down and read some of the stuff, she had kind of a muted reaction to it. She's like, it was good. And I was like, okay, sounds like you have some more notes for me that you're holding back or something. And she said basically like, I like it and I can appreciate it, but now having known you for a certain amount of time, I feel like you are a funny guy, or you try to be funny at least, and you appreciate humor. Like it's a quality that you appreciate so much in other people and in other art. And so I'm sort of confused by why this work that you've done is a little serious and a little bit on the pretentious side. and it really had an impact on me. And it wasn't like I suddenly switched over and was just trying to do pure gags or anything, but it sort of gave me the impetus to try and expand what I put into the comics and try and at least capture a broader range of my personality and put that into the work. And I think that started showing up in Killing and Dying to a degree. And I think this book is the best example of that yet.
Nice. You always got to listen to the wife. What?
Yeah, absolutely.
Always the best sounding board. Always the best.
Yes. And as I've said before, that she comes from a Brooklyn Irish family with a long tradition of storytelling and joke telling, not often with a high priority on the truth, but a priority on getting the biggest laugh, getting the biggest impact, even if it's on the dark end of the spectrum. Who's going to tell the most depressing story? It's almost competitive, Yeah,
well, I like the change. I mean, I like your serious stuff too, but I like the fact that this was a lighter book and despite the dark title and some dark places too, but it's funny and it's light and it moves and it's what you want from cartoons sometimes,
Yeah, well, and I was so glad that this was the book of mine that was going to come out in the middle of a pandemic, because I felt like if I get feedback from people who said that it brought them a little laughter right now, I feel like that's something useful. Maybe two more.
Here we go. One more. Great. Matthew Manos, Hands of Fate. God, that was an obscure joke. Do you approach day-to-day life in search of a story and capture them in a journal regularly, or do you reflect back in time more loosely?
In the earlier days of my career, it was the former, and I was more like the kind of guy who would carry around a notebook and was constantly jotting things down. Definitely on the search for stories and material and kind of prying into other people's lives a little bit and wondering if I could get away with using it as material. And then now it's definitely more the latter. And it's like with Killing and Dying, I really thought that I was writing pure fiction. Like that was the challenge for me, was like, I was like, I don't want to do anything autobiographical. I don't want to do anything semi-autobiographical. I want to invent characters that seem as different from me as possible and put them in settings and just lifestyles that are different from mine. And so it was more, I really tried not to draw on my life and my own experiences for that book. And I tried to really invent things and hypothesize. And in the end, it ended up being, I think in a lot of ways, until now, at least the most personal book that I'd done. And I like the result. I like that way of working, of sort of tricking yourself or thinking that you're going to make everything up and write something that doesn't pertain to your life at all, but then also allowing, even down to the last minute as you're drawing, to let little ideas from your life sneak in, or emotions, or for me a lot of it was anxieties or fears. So it would be like, I've got these made up characters, and then I would start to think about something that was actually bothering me, especially like as a new parent. And then that would subliminally work its way into the narrative in some way. And I like the way that came out.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. All right, I think I have two more questions for you. The first of which is, you obviously do a lot of work at the New Yorker. Now, this is a world I don't know or understand at all.
Yeah.
I get how comics work, but in my head, and this is probably completely wrong, but in my head, working for the New Yorker is like, it's like being in an episode of Mad Men or something. Like I picture guys in big, those big kind of long coats, bringing in a portfolio of their work to an art director, who looks through and goes, this one, no, not that one, and is it even remotely like that? I mean, what's the process like, particularly doing those kind of single illustrations where you have to nail it in a single illustration?
Well, I would say that as much as it's possible in this era, that the New Yorker does still have a connection to that old world that you're describing, and you still get little hints of that when you go visit their offices, or they have like an annual holiday party where you'll find yourself, in the room with someone whose name you've been reading your entire life in the New Yorker or something like that. Or you'll see, a bunch of guys and you find out who they are, and they're like gag cartoonists they're just so ingrained in your consciousness. And you're in the middle of Manhattan. So it does have a little bit of that feeling left, more so than I would imagine at most magazines. But for me, it's largely remote, just like all my other work, where I work from home. We email, the final illustration is just sent to them by email, and then it just magically shows up in the magazine. I've had the good luck, really throughout my career, I really owe a lot to a very small group of people that I've worked with for a long time and have developed a great relationship with. So that involves all the people at Drawn and Quarterly. And there's sort of a similar situation at the New Yorker, where there's a handful of people who I've been working with from the start, basically. The art director who gave me my first assignment inside the magazine is still there, and she still gives me work, and we have a great working relationship. The person that I work with on the covers is Francoise Mouly, who's been, unbeknownst to her, she's been a part of my life for a very long time, just because I was a fan of Raw when I was a young reader, and was a reader of the New Yorker before I started working for them. And so she was the person who encouraged me and sort of guided me through the process of doing my first cover back in, I think, 2004. And I have worked with her closely on every single cover I've done since then. And we have just an amazing shorthand, and especially, now that we're working remotely and it's more chaotic and our time is more limited, we get things done with like the absolute minimum of fuss and confusion, and it's very lucky for me, for sure.
Yeah. Is it still very much you're pitching them, or are they pitching ideas to you? I've never really understood how it works with an art director.
It's completely every variation on that. I recently had an experience where an art director said, we want to have like what they call a sketchbook page, which is kind of like a one-page illustration within the magazine, but it's not tied to an article. And she actually had an idea. She's like, I saw this thing, and would you want to turn that into one of these illustrations? Unfortunately, my submitted idea was deemed too uncouth for the New Yorker, so it didn't work out. But And then there are a lot of covers that I've done that have been just complete blind submissions. Like just an idea came to me and I drew a rough version of it and emailed it in, and then they said, okay, let's do that. Sometimes I'm guided a little bit by timeliness. Like they'll say, oh, I don't know, whatever, Halloween is coming up. Do you have any ideas that might relate to that? And then most of the stuff inside the magazine is very specific assignments. They'll say, do an illustration based on this movie review that's coming up. Yeah. Or something like that.
It would seem to me that it's based upon what you described, that it's very different than doing your own comics, where you're your own editor. You decide what is good or what's not. What kind of a failure rate do you have of submitting ideas versus them rejecting those ideas?
With the illustrations, like where it's like a specific assignment, very low. That usually works out pretty well. With covers, I'd say let me think. 75% success, 25% failure. Yeah.
Well, that seems like a phenomenal rate to me. I mean, I don't know how it works there, but that seems really
well
good.
I think there's different approaches. I think that there are some artists who do the shotgun method, where they're just constantly sending in any idea that comes to them, and one out of however many is picked, and that's sort of how they work. They just got to keep generating ideas and throwing them out there. And I'm a slow worker, and I just often am busy with other things. Like I've never felt like I'm a full-time New Yorker illustrator or something like that. And so if I was, maybe I would try a different approach. But generally, I wait until I have an idea that I feel really strongly about, and I do a lot of preparatory work before I even show it to them. I'll go through different approaches to it in a sketch form, and I will submit a pretty solid version of it to them just to see if they like it or not. And so sometimes that gets rejected, but it's a lot of preparatory work before it really gets to them.
Feel free to reject this question out of hand if you want.
Okay.
But I'm always curious about cartoonists supporting themselves.
Yeah.
Do you make enough income from your comics alone to support yourself?
No.
Or okay, the balance of working for a big thing versus doing your own stuff.
I think I'm glad that, like, I think in a different era, this would be sort of like a déclassé topic to get into or something like that. But I think I would have benefited from a lot to hear about this kind of stuff when I was younger. So I'm hoping that it's useful in that way. But no, I think especially it's skewed because I live in like one of the most expensive cities in the world. So it's not. No, I don't put out stuff enough, and it doesn't sell in the quantities that it would take for that to be my primary source of income. And so it's definitely necessary, and fortunately it's something that I love. But to do the illustration work, I'm fortunate that I'm able to sort of focus in mostly on the New Yorker and work with people that I love for a magazine that I'm a fan of. As opposed to when I was younger, I would do like advertising work and things like that. And it's also, and I think this is one of the kind of the case for working in the old fashioned way, is that the sale of artwork has been huge to me.
Sure.
If you work all digitally, you don't have quite the option to do this. But selling artwork, whether it's New Yorker covers or comics pages, has been a huge component for me, for sure.
Yeah, no, and I think that's one of the things that that the young class of cartoonists coming in, it's really important for them to know those kinds of things, because That's certainly been true throughout the history of comics, that the sales of original
Yeah.
art, and also having multiple revenue streams. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
to be able to serialize your work and get paid at least somewhat for that, and then to have the book, you know, and to get paid again, and then, you know, if you're popular, then you have multiple formats of your book. You know, you have the soft, you have the hardcover. Someday you might have the fancy signed hardcover, et cetera, et cetera. Each time making more money off the same work you've already created once. And one of the things that I wonder if all of these graduating classes that are putting out, you know, 10 new cartoonists a year at 5 different schools, if they're actually teaching kids this part of it, the how do you make money as a long-term career off this?
Well, I think a few things, since we brought this up, that I would think are worth pointing out, especially I think when you're a young cartoonist and you're living alone, and you're thrilled if you can make enough money to buy a pizza and some beer and pay your share of the rent or whatever. That can sort of guide some of your decisions. Or you might think, this publisher is offering me a better advance right now. They might not keep my book in print forever, but I'll take that advance. Right. I think it might not be true of everyone, but I know I certainly had that mindset. And then somehow magically I was in a position where I had 2 kids, and my wife was trying to get her PhD, and she wasn't working, and we were living in an expensive city. And suddenly I was like getting out artwork and selling it to collectors, and I was able to pay the rent, you know, or I would get a check from Drawn and Quarterly for 5 books of mine that they've kept in print since the day they came out, and I don't have to lift a finger anymore. And so those things have been very important to me. And I think sometimes they're long-term things or hypothetical, they relate to hypothetical situations that are hard to imagine yourself in when you're younger. But those 2 things have definitely saved my ass more than once.
Yeah, nice. Thanks for being willing to answer that, because
I'm happy to. Yeah,
because as you said, it's not a question that everybody feels comfortable with. So on the same lines, well, not really the same lines, but my final question would be to young cartoonists who are watching this, because I'm certainly not just now this second, but over the next couple of years, people will be watching this interview. What would be the piece of advice that you would give a young cartoonist who's breaking in, who wants to work in comics? What would you say to them?
Well, it's definitely, my answer to that has definitely changed in recent years, and I think you can sort of predict it based on having read this book. And it's not really, I could get into all kinds of practical advice about, like, you know, don't get hung up on using the quote unquote right tools, and, you know, find what works for you and facilitates the work, things like that. But I think on a bigger scale, and I think this, I hate saying it because it's really antithetical to what, you know, if I was giving if I was addressing a class of graduating seniors or something like that. But I would really advise people to consider, not necessarily do this, but to at least consider the idea that the life outside of making comics is fleeting and is important, and some of those experiences might actually mean more to you later in life than the 5 extra pages of comics you produced. I know there's sort of a heroism or a valiant nature that's ascribed to the workaholics and the perfectionists in this industry. And people are really rewarded when you see like a young cartoonist who did a 1,000-page graphic novel or something like that. And I understand that, and I've definitely been a part of it. But at this point in my life, I can tell you that I look back on a lot of that work from that period in my life, and I'm, more than anything, I'm ashamed of it. and I regret some of it. But there are a lot of experiences that I passed up in order to create that work that I'll never get a chance to recapture, and that's something that really haunts me in a way. And so I hate to give any kind of advice that says to work less, and I'm not necessarily saying that, but I don't know. I would have appreciated someone giving me that possibility of a way of thinking when I was younger.
Yeah, and I'd also imagine that the more experiences that you have outside of sitting at the drawing board, the more you're going to make better comics as a result.
Yeah,
comics are life, and life should reflect comics or something like that. I didn't say that.
Absolutely. No, I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. I want to thank you, Adrian, for taking the time to talk to us. You are an excellent cartoonist, and we always enjoy your work here. And as I said, this was a strong book. If you're sitting watching at home and you have not yet got a copy of The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist, I absolutely recommend it. And again, I want to thank you for your time, for being here.
My pleasure, Brian, and thanks for continuing to be a comics retailer. I mean, I know it can be a daunting endeavor, but it means the world to me that people like you are still at it and have supported my work from the beginning. So thank you.
It's really not any different from the things you were describing about how you are a cartoonist, and it's the same thing. I like seeing the work that people like you do and then getting it out to people. That is what thrills me. And, as I said, I just had a heart attack, but I'm still here doing this because it fills my soul with so much joy to talk to people about craft and art and making art and how they do it and why they do it. It just makes me feel healthier and better. So So you're making me ultimately healthier and more well.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it so much. And especially now, I really feel like it really is such a small world, and there's such a very particular handful of people who ran or run important comic shops throughout my life and have had an impact both on me as a reader, as a consumer, and now as an artist. And of course, you're one of those. So I thank you for having done that.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. So thank you. We got to thank Jordan for doing our tech work. Yay, Jordan. We want to thank The Beat for being our sponsor and helping us get this out and keeping it live. I want to thank all of the viewers at home and all the members of the club. If you like this interview, if you like this book, if you like what we're doing, please join the club, because it is literally the thing that's keeping the store alive these days. That's how it works today. Next month, we're back with, I didn't bring a copy with me, but with Unrig, How to Fix a Broken Democracy. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation and probably the most political conversation we've ever had. So look for that next month. And once again, thank you very much for being here. Have a great night.
Thank you.